General Garland, for your leadership, service to the country, and your presence here today. Earlier this year, the House passed on a bipartisan basis by a vote of 414 to 11 the Effective Assistance of Counsel in the Digital Era Act, which would limit the ability of the Bureau of Prisons to monitor private communications, email communications between detainees in the BOP's custody and their attorneys. We concluded in a bipartisan way that this practice, which has occurred under Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, needs to be addressed. We're seeking technical assistance from the Department of Justice and the BOP. I sent a letter to you in that regard yesterday. I asked unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that it be entered into the record.
Without objection.
And I look forward to your response and to working with the Department of Justice on this issue. Voter fraud, if proven, is a serious crime that carries a 5-year prison sentence. Is that right?
I'm not sure about the sentence, but yes, if proven, it's a serious crime.
And the Department of Justice is responsible for investigating and prosecuting voter fraud. Is that right?
With respect to federal voting, yes.
Now, your predecessor, Bill Barr, publicly acknowledged that the Department of Justice had uncovered zero evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. Is that still accurate?
It's my recollection that that is what he concluded, and I don't know of any evidence to the contrary.
Right. There's no evidence that voter fraud impacted the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, true?
That's correct. That's correct.
It's fair to say that despite a global pandemic and record voter turnout, as prior members of the Trump administration have acknowledged, the 2020 election was the most secure in American history?
That is the conclusion of the Justice Department and of the intelligence community and of the Department of Homeland Security, yes.
And despite the fact that there's no evidence of so-called fraud, this year at least 19 states have enacted 33 laws making it harder for everyday Americans to vote. And in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, instead of running toward democracy, there are people throughout this country, some have run away from this democracy, and they've unleashed an epidemic of voter suppression across the land. So let me just ask a few questions about some of the things that have occurred. How does banning churches and civic groups from giving food and water to voters, some of whom have been waiting in line for hours, prevent or address voter fraud?
So, Congressman, I don't want to talk too much about that because that is the subject of our lawsuit against the state of Georgia, but you have identified a segment of that statute that we have challenged as being unlawful.
And does restricting the times that someone can cast their vote to business hours when many Americans are at work relate in any way rationally to protecting the integrity of our elections?
So let me just talk generally about this. So I believe that every eligible voter should be able to vote and that there should be no restrictions on voters that make it more difficult for them to vote unless they're absolutely necessary. The Justice Department is limited in its ability to bring cases. It must find discriminatory intent or effect. So those are the kind of cases that are covered by Section 2. But as a general matter, my view is that everyone should have the ability to vote as readily and easily as possible.
And you testified earlier today that, in fact, one of the founding reasons for the Department of Justice is to defend civil rights in the nation. In that particular context, I believe it was in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, where the rights of African Americans were under assault. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. We still see race-based assaults on civil rights taking place today. And I would just urge the Department of Justice, as it has been doing under your leadership, to continue to do all that's possible to defend and protect the integrity of the right to vote. Let me just also comment that, there are some who continue to lie about the election. They're lying about COVID. They're lying about the Department of Justice. Mr. Attorney General, you're a man of great integrity, and under your leadership, the Department of Justice is off to a good start. We appreciate the work that you're doing. Keep it up on behalf of the American people and the Constitution. I yield back.